Hello, I'm Bruce Adolphe with Episode 5. In the 1970s, it was relatively easy to find an affordable apartment on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, traditionally the neighborhood of classical musicians from students to established artists. I moved into apartment 7N of 160 West 71st Street and was happy with my 2 rooms, one of which had a kitchenette, and I easily managed the $350 a month rent. My building was full of musicians and actors. Every time I left my apartment and stood waiting for the elevator, the hallway echoed with the sounds of musicians practicing and singing, sounding very much like the halls of a conservatory. And in fact, many of the inhabitants were the same people I would meet during the day at Juilliard. In 7N, there was also the operatic coloratura singing of my yellow-fronted Amazon parrot, Polly Rhythm, who had been in my family since I was 10 and who practiced as much or more than anyone in the building. By the time Polly and I moved into 7N, Polly's coloratura capabilities were polished, and he sang at particular times. When the sun shone, when I vacuumed the apartment, when I played the piano, when the phone rang, when a siren blared on the street, when I played a record, when the radio was on, and when friends came over. So even though we had fairly thick walls between the apartments of this building, it was inevitable that people on my floor knew that I lived with a soprano. One day there was a knock at the door, and for some reason Polly was not at that very moment singing. I opened the door partway and saw a radiant, beautiful young woman standing there. She spoke shyly with a lovely, melodious, high and resonant voice. She said, "Hi. My name is Cathy, and I'm a soprano, and I believe your wife or girlfriend is also a soprano, so I thought I would introduce myself. I live in 7P. I came out with it quickly. Actually, the soprano you've been hearing is my bird. He's a parrot. Come on in and meet him." Cathy entered, and upon stepping into the room, she immediately saw the huge cage, the tree branches I had taken from Central Park attached to the wall, and the queen of the night himself, Polly Rhythm, standing on one of the branches. Cathy turned out to be Kathleen Battle, though she was not yet a famous soprano. She and Polly got along extremely well right from the start. Cathy visited fairly frequently to sing with Polly. Even a brief exchange of trills and arpeggios was exhilarating for woman and bird alike, and I enjoyed it immensely too. Around that time, I received a phone call from the conductor, John Nelson, who was then the director of the Cincinnati May Festival. He had called to discuss a piece of music, but as we talked, Polly started to sing. John said, "Who is that soprano? Is that your wife? I mean, I would love to hear her in an audition. She seems incredible." I said, "If you don't mind hiring a very small green feathered soprano with some beautiful red on his wings, I will be happy to set up an audition." Silence. Coloratura soprano and instruments practicing were not the only sounds in my building. Marshall, who lived next door in 7M, played Sinatra records very loudly every Friday night, sometimes without stopping straight through to Sunday night. One afternoon, when I was studying some scores, there was an agitated knock on my door. Expecting no one, I looked through the peephole and saw a man I didn't know. He looked frightened and desperate. I cracked open my door and asked, "What do you want?" He was practically in tears. "I think Marshall is dead. I've been calling him all week, and now I knocked at his door and there is no answer, and there's a terrible smell coming from his apartment." Marshall, the Sinatra fan, dead? Marshall was a young man, and this guy in the hallway seemed to have a legitimate fear. I called 911 and said someone might be dead in the building, my next-door neighbor, someone young. I gave my address and said I lived on the 7th floor in 7N. Some police arrived in a few minutes. They told me to go into my apartment and wait for the detective. About 20 minutes later, there were 2 loud knocks on my door. "It's Detective Costa, homicide. Open the door, please." I opened the door, and in walked a perfect Hollywood detective, smoking a cigar, wearing a trench coat, a crushed hat on his head. "Mind if I sit down?" he asked. The detective and I sat at the dining area table. He asked me my name, and then he asked me, "Do you mind if I smoke?" as he was blowing horrid-smelling smoke just over my head. Well, actually, I started to answer. He put it out and said, "It helps to smoke a cigar when you spend time with decaying bodies." Then he continued, "What do you do for a living, Mr. Adolphe?" I'm a musician." "What kind of musician?" "Classical. I'm a composer." "If you are a musician, why don't you live in the Dakota?" "Not all musicians live in that building." Yeah. "Did you ever write anything like this?" And with a gritty baritone, Detective Costa sang, "You light up my life." No, nothing like that," I said. Suddenly, he looked me in the eyes and said steadily, in a strangely matter-of-fact voice, "You know we got a murder here." I said nothing. I hardly moved. He said, "You don't seem very surprised." Well, I called 911 and the guy in the hallway was terrified, and so I couldn't help but think, okay. So tell me, did you know the guy next door? Marshall? Oh, you know his name, I see. Marshall. Was Marshall a friend of yours? No, not really. So you knew him, but you didn't like him? Well, no, I didn't really like him. I felt I should be completely honest. I was hiding nothing. Detective Costa continued, "Why didn't you like Marshall?" "He played Sinatra albums very loudly from Friday night through Sunday night every weekend. It would drive me crazy." Detective Costa looked at me intently and said, "The other night, did you hear something like this?" And he slammed the tabletop with enormous force. I shook my head no. "Yeah, well, maybe you weren't home because you would have heard it. When a crowbar hits a skull, you can hear it through the wall." I sat in the deepest silence I had ever known. He continued, "You didn't hear Sinatra albums this past weekend, did you?" No, I guess not." "No, I'm sure you did not." The detective rose and said, "Don't leave town, I mean that, till you hear from me." I stood up, but he let himself out of the apartment. I sat down, and the door suddenly opened, and there he was again. Detective Costa said, "You know, Mr. Adolphe, if you did write one song like what I sang, you could move to the Dakota." He smiled and left, closing the door extremely quietly. They eventually caught the murderer. By staying in Marshall's apartment, the detective eventually got the information he needed. That happened in 1977. I wanted to move, but I didn't. Then in 1980, I heard the gunshot that killed John Lennon, who lived in the Dakota, just 2 blocks north. Kathleen Battle had moved out and become a celebrated opera singer. I turned my attention to opera also, and I wrote 3 operas while living in the apartment 7N. The first was a one-act based on Edgar Allan Poe's The Telltale Heart, a tale of murder. The next 2 operas I composed in apartment 7N were for Jewish Opera at the Y, then a fairly new program at the 92nd Street Y on Lexington Avenue. These 2 operas were Michoil's the Wise, about the Jewish actor Solomon Michoils, who was murdered by Stalin, and The False Messiah, about the life of Shabtai Tzvi, who claimed to be the Messiah in 1666. The librettist for both of these operas was Mel Gordon, whose writing was a mix of obsessive historical documentation and ferocious poetry. Amy Kaiser conducted both operas, and the singers included the soprano Erie Mills in her New York operatic debut. A day after the premiere of Michoil's, my phone rang, and when I answered, there was a very posh English accented voice on the other end. He said, "Hello, this is Andrew Porter, calling for Bruce Adolphe." Well, even though I knew that Andrew Porter was the music critic for The New Yorker, I absurdly assumed that this was not really Andrew Porter, but my friend Toby Apple, the violist, pretending to be Andrew Porter. So I put on an equally aristocratic English accent and replied, "Oh, so you are Andrew Porter, are you? How lovely." There was a brief silence, and then I heard, "Seriously, this is Andrew Porter. Are you Mr. Adolphe?" My throat went dry and I felt momentarily dizzy, but quickly pulling myself together and dropping the accent entirely, I replied, "Yes, this is Bruce. Sorry, I thought you were someone else." He continued, "In any case, I would like to chat with you about your opera. Would you mind coming to my apartment for the interview? I live at 160 West 71st Street. Now I thought, maybe this was Toby. He lives at the same address? I answered with the truth. How strange. I also live at 160 West 71st Street. Then Porter, sounding somewhat irritated, said, "Do you really? What apartment?" I'm in 7N. I see. Well, I live in the penthouse. Since we live in the same building, why don't you pop up to my penthouse in half an hour? I could be there in a few minutes, actually. All right, then come right up. I grabbed a score to Michoil's, popped into the very same hallway where all those police had once stood and where Detective Costa had smoked his cigar, and I called the elevator. The penthouse was completely different than any other apartment in the building. It was enormous, and it had a balcony that wrapped around most of the building, giving a splendid view of the Upper West Side. Mr. Porter turned out to be elegant, charming, and seriously interested in my opera. He had paid a great deal of attention to it. His review was strikingly accurate in its technical description of the music. And a year later, after The False Messiah was premiered, he wrote another, more extensive article about all three of my operas. Another critic, writing for some New York paper, had written a mixed review of The False Messiah and had actually said some nasty things about the whole idea of the opera. Andrew Porter told me not to pay attention to that review. And when I mentioned that I thought I would write back to the critic, he said firmly that I should never answer critics. "Definitely not worth your time," he said, "and would only lead to worse things from such people." Eventually, I did move from 160 West 71st Street, apartment 7N, to a loft in Soho. There, Polyrhythm had even more space in which to roam and sing and test out acoustics. He learned to imitate a cat, because our next-door neighbors were Maurice and Lulu, who lived with their owners, Tom and Victoria. And now, after many years back on the Upper West Side, Polly not only sings opera, but he still does a thoroughly realistic meow. To be continued.